So, I always have to put my laptop like on top of a book to get like the best sort of like angle of the camera and stuff. And today, in honor of our discussion, I've got Henry Kissinger's Years of Renewal is holding up the laptop for our foreign policy discussion.
My wife is doing an interview at our dining room table, and she always, in order to, create the illusion of professionalism, has to have like 10 books under the laptop to bring it up. So she's got...
Are they all yours, Ross? All copies of Ross's books?
Carlos.
Yeah.
She only reads my books.
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lydia Polgreen.
I'm Michelle Caudle.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm Carlos Lozada.
And this is Matter of Opinion. This is the first episode of what I think will be a whole bunch. I think we want to talk about what are the big issues and the big questions that are going to be playing out in the election this year. So I'm going to ask a question and want you guys to give me a quick answer. So who here stands by the truism that voters don't care about foreign policy?
Okay, I am the one this is my mantra, but it's that
you
voters
always
don't...
say this, Michelle.
Voters don't vote on foreign policy. It's different.
That's not what she asked.
That's not what I asked.
It's a wrinkle.
Yeah.
Well, but the thing is, you said voters, right? Didn't say just like Americans. I think part of the problem is calling it foreign policy. It sounds so like rarefied and elite, and that creates the sense of distance. But do people care about how America throws its weight around in the world? Do they care about threats to America emanating from around the world? I think they do.
If there are troops on the ground, they do. If there aren't, they're not voting on it.
Ross, weigh in here.
Yeah, I think it's a 90-10 thing, 90% of the time, which is not bad for a truism, right? Voters don't really care much about foreign policy, but there is that crucial 10% of the time, under which I would include voters care about apparent disasters, like the Iran hostage crisis, or I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan genuinely hurt Joe Biden for a while and sort of changed perceptions of his presidency. And voters care when America or our allies, and our allies is a sort of loose category, unstable and shifting, but when America and our allies seem to be under attack, voters care about that.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to get into a lot of the history and also the ways in which we define foreign policy, is shifting over time. I wanted to talk about this because obviously the situation in Israel and before that the war in Ukraine, which as it happens continues to be a very big deal, because I think that these global entanglements may upend the usual consensus, perhaps in unexpected ways in this election year, given the state of the world. And it really seems tough to neatly divide between the foreign and domestic. Like, is the crisis in Israel and Gaza a foreign story or a domestic story? It's kind of both, and it's percolating through in lots of different ways. So let's start with history. Carlos, I'm going to turn to you.
Professor Lozada.
Do you think there are examples of places where foreign policy has been like a make or break issue? And this is a bit of a gimme because I think like your favorite topic, Jimmy Carter, is like a wonderful example of this. But maybe you have another
one. It's your opportunity to talk about Carter.
I was reading Carter's 15th memoir, and I remember,
Lydia.
well, I mean, like the Iran hostage crisis was a drag on Jimmy Carter's reelection prospects. Not the only drag. There were many, but it mattered. I mean, certainly he thought it mattered when he looked back on it. One that we sometimes forget because he was never president. He didn't win. But like Ross Perot's challenge for the presidency in the 90s, was premised in part in his opposition to NAFTA, right?
Yep.
And he didn't win a single state, but he won like close to 19% of the national vote in 92. And it was, that was a foreign policy issue, though one clearly with a lot of domestic implications, the great sucking sound of jobs, as he put it. It's not always negative, though. Like George W. Bush's 2004 reelection campaign was overwhelmingly all about 9/11.
Yep.
Even though like the attack happened on his watch and, he was running against an actual veteran in John Kerry. But if you remember the Republican convention in 2004, since I'm an old man, I remember it well. It was just like every other word was 9 and then the other word was 11. So, these are moments when it matters. I mean, one way that I find interesting is when it affects not just who wins an election, but it affects who the nominees are, right?
Yep.
Like LBJ couldn't bring the party together over Vietnam, so he didn't run, for re-election.
Mm-hmm.
And George H.W. Bush looked unbeatable after the Gulf War, so some of the big name Democrats opted not to run against him, right? Thinking they had no shot. So that opened the door for Bill Clinton. Obama became the nominee in 2008 in a significant part, I think, because he could point to this long ago speech in which he had called Iraq a dumb war, as opposed to all the other Democrats who had, reluctantly or not, supported it. And then, and of course he ran against John McCain, who had supported the war. So I think there's plenty of ways in which it matters not just to who wins elections, but to even who gets nominated for the presidency.
Totally. And I mean, I think, John Kerry being a veteran was, supposed to be a selling point in 2004.
Reporting for duty was how he started.
Yeah.
How he started his speech. Yeah.
Until he got swift-boated.
And then it turned out he was a complete dork who couldn't relate to the American public because he would go windsurfing. And then that was all she wrote. It didn't matter what he had done in the war.
I hear he knew some French.
Well,
which is a problem.
Let me speak up for John Kerry, though, and also maybe challenge Carlos's analysis a little bit, because the people who say foreign policy doesn't actually matter often will cite that 2004 election and say, look, we have this whole sort of elite level journalistic discourse about, Kerry was nominated to blunt Bush's advantage on foreign policy, and it didn't succeed because Bush actually won. But if you look at, the political scientists who try and create, estimates of what result you should expect from the economic fundamentals alone, John Kerry actually overperformed the fundamentals in 2004 based on economic growth rates.
I'm sure that's
George
great consolation to him.
Well, I'm just saying George W. Bush should have won by more, which could be cited as proof that only elites cared about foreign policy in that election, or it could be cited as proof that actually the Kerry shtick was fairly effective. It just wasn't effective enough to overcome Bush's advantage on the economy, which again is not how anyone remembers that election. I agree, but that's what the economic fundamentalists would say.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think that the other question that I have is like, how do you define what is a foreign issue and what is a domestic issue? And, I have this theory that things that happen abroad sort of take time to kind of percolate through the aquifer of American politics and become domestic issues. And I think like the Iraq War, it took some time for like what was happening over there to sort of fully work its way into our politics over here. And I think one of the things that I'm wondering in this moment is like, has that time continuum actually collapsed? Like, obviously we're living in the latter days of globalization and the smaller world and all of that kind of stuff. But it does feel like, things out there and things right here are collapsing into our politics in a closer way. And that's partly because of migration. And
okay, I'm going to jump in here and say
I'm just trying to figure out how to spell aquifer. I'm just looking it up. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm going to draw the distinction of with the Iraq War, we had troops on the ground. We had lots of troops on the ground. We had troops on the ground in Afghanistan. We do not have troops on the ground right now. So you can collapse all you want to, but people are not going to care about Ukraine. The one situation that I think could be the exception is Israel.
Yeah.
The Gaza war has become a domestic policy issue that is splitting along unusual political lines. And I do think that Israel tends to be unique, but I think it is the exception to the rule.
Yeah. But I think that there's something to this notion that, we expect a commander-in-chief to have a certain kind of Ross flecked at this, the Afghanistan withdrawal moment for Biden. I mean, that was the moment when his approval rating went negative, and
right.
it hasn't recovered since. Why do you think that was such a kind of hinge point for the Biden presidency?
I mean, I don't think we know for sure that Biden's approval ratings wouldn't have started sinking without that, right? It was an inflection point. But I think, if you'd flash forward 6 months or a year and asked voters what they cared about and why they were down on Joe Biden, they would have mostly said inflation and gas prices, right? Not Afghanistan. And even when the Washington Post published their version of the Pentagon Papers as the Afghanistan Papers, showing sort of how, America's military and political leadership had sort of botched Afghanistan without admitting it for years and years and years. None of that made a huge difference politically. What made a huge difference politically was, one, things are going really badly, and two, our soldiers are there. I think a question is whether social media in that creates that kind of immediacy that you're talking about, Lydia, even for crises that don't involve American troops directly. That seemed to be true at least for the beginning of the Ukraine war. American boots weren't on the ground, but we had this kind of crazy sort of transmission of not just images, but video, and, sort of you could watch the war unfold, right? And there's been versions of that with Israel and Gaza. But I'm less sure how much that changes American public opinion as opposed to like crazy online discourse, which are still overlapping but not completely the same thing.
I think there's another way in which the withdrawal from Afghanistan has an impact, whether it's sort of a lasting enough impact to matter in the election later this year. I don't know. But the thing about the Afghanistan withdrawal is that in a way, it was sort of Biden decisiveness saying, like, this is never going to be good, so we just have to get out. But it looked like it sort of made him seem like he was not in control of a situation, as, the way it unfolded so chaotically. And so in that sense, the way Biden ended up looking, weakened his kind of the overall perception of voters who would care about foreign policy, even in this kind of minimalist way. If
you listen to people on the campaign trail talk about Biden versus Trump, you'll get a fair number of them that are like, yes, Trump is crazy. He is bombastic. He is erratic. He is unhinged. But that's what we need in this scary time because he's dealing with crazy people. So it is Trump's projection of strength that these folks like, even though they acknowledge that it is not exactly a sort of balanced approach.
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because if you see the way the debate about Ukraine is playing out, the Ukraine funding is playing out, which is a sort of classic foreign policy issue, the trade-off that is being pushed is explicitly like, we don't want to fund the war in Ukraine unless we secure our southern border. And which of those is a domestic issue and which of those is a foreign issue? I think most people would think of immigration as being largely a domestic issue, but it's striking to me that those are the things that are being discussed. I mean, our colleague Tom Friedman argued this week that, funding the war in Ukraine with no cost of American troops is the best security bargain. And that's sort of one perspective, right? But I think that there is a very real discussion going on about, how we're spending money. And I think that's a very politically potent question.
Well, Trump's republicanism is very isolationist, and that is one way that he is bashing Nikki Haley on the trail, which is that she's a warmonger. She is the old school hawkish Republican. I mean, and Ross, you kind of have sympathies in that direction.
I have some sympathy.
Yeah.
I have some sympathy for that critique of Nikki Haley. Yeah, I mean, I think that but to keep it on the what hurts presidents, right? I think what unites the border and foreign policy is that they are areas where you can say that presidents get punished by voters for a perception of the world being out of control.
Yeah.
And I think this is generally one of Biden's problems, that even though the U.S. and its allies have done reasonably well in propping up Ukraine, right, that when you combine Russia invading Ukraine with our southern border is out of control, with war in the Middle East, and the Red Sea shipping lanes are being closed, and Iran and Pakistan are firing missiles at each other, which maybe from a grand strategy point of view doesn't matter to the U.S., but adds to this sense of a world where the Pax Americana is breaking down. And so it's not even sort of one discrete foreign policy crisis that's a problem, it's the whole thing. And this is where the sort of crude heuristic of, Donald Trump seems tough and Joe Biden doesn't, can matter politically, because the reality is that a lot of these crises were not happening during Trump's presidency, which was chaotic in other ways, but Putin invaded during Biden's presidency.
Yep.
Hamas attacked during Biden's presidency. And I think that is the kind of thing that voters pay attention to.
And Trump explicitly claims credit for it not happening on his watch.
Yep.
Let's leave it there. But before we go to the break, I want to read a listener email we got from Kevin. Kevin writes, Biden would have more support if his foreign policies were as sensible and humane as his domestic policies. He should end our war with Russia, our Gaza genocide, and our trade war with China. Wow. Let's unpack that. We'll be right back. And we're back. So before we went to break, we heard from Kevin, who argued that Biden would have more support if his foreign policy was more, quote, sensible and humane, unquote. And so I want to talk about Kevin's argument, especially in light of another truism, which is that when foreign policy does factor into an election, it typically favors the incumbent. What do you guys think?
It depends on how things are going. I mean, LBJ can tell you that it doesn't necessarily favor the incumbent. I think what people tend to talk about is a rally around the flag effect, which used to, be assumed in these situations. If you're at war, the country comes together, they rally around. Also, there was the whole truism, U.S. politics
stops at the water's edge.
Stops at the water's edge. That absolutely doesn't hold true anymore. So I'm not sure that this one seems to stick like it used to.
I think you can see in Kevin's email, the listener email that we read just before the break, one of the reasons why the current set of foreign policy crises doesn't help Joe Biden, because Kevin was basically arguing for a mix of policies that could all be classified as sort of on the left in the sense of being sort of, anti-war, anti-intervention. But that combination really doesn't map onto
any sort of political constituency that could work.
Exactly.
It maps onto Kevin.
Well, I mean, it does. It maps onto, I should say, a small and specific part of the American left. But that is not that significant. The sort of normal Democratic stance has been we should support Ukraine's war with Russia. They don't say our war with Russia. And then there's a kind of bipartisan consensus right now that we need to be tougher on China, although that has critics on the left and on the center. And then Gaza and Israel is the issue that just clearly divides Biden's coalition in big and important ways domestically. And, having an issue front and center that divides your coalition is just not helpful when you're running for re-election.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that
there's a truism for you.
Yeah, I mean, the Israel-Gaza situation does feel really different from most foreign policy issues and different from the way that Israel issues have played out in the past. The thing about the situation in Israel and in Gaza that I think is specifically perilous for Joe Biden is that there's specific constituencies in his coalition that may just not show up because they're really angry and upset about the way that Joe Biden has comported himself. I look at the state of Michigan, right, which is always a battleground state and is he won very, very narrowly. There is a significant Arab American vote in Michigan that I just seeing these interviews with Muslim voters in swing states and saying I've never in my life been a single issue voter, but now I am a single issue voter, and this is my issue. So I think it's, yes, it's foreign policy, but it's clear that there are, other voters who really like Joe Biden's, staunch support of Israel and that will politically be important for him. But I do think that in very ways specific to this situation, it's likely to play out domestically in what's going to be a very close election.
Oh, I think you're totally right. And it goes beyond even the Arab American community. I mean, this has become a part of American culture wars. You have younger voters, younger progressives in particular. And again, I have college students and, a high school senior and their friends and stuff. They talk about this as a defining issue as whether or not they support Joe Biden. And it has become like an international version of Black Lives Matter to some degree. And in fact, you see Black Lives Matter and a lot of Black activists aligning with the pro-Palestinian movement and turning it into a much bigger issue. You get a lot of talk about colonizers and oppressors, and it has just kind of folded itself into other issues that are really, really hot button issues domestically.
I mean, it toppled two college presidents.
Yeah,
in
you
the
have
Ivy
university
League,
presidents
right?
being
Yeah.
hauled before Congress and run out for not being sufficiently hard on anti-Semitism on their campuses, theoretically. So it is spiraling.
Although that's not why the Harvard president was ousted,
It is exactly
right?
why they went after her.
Yeah, but,
And you know-
she survived that part of it. She didn't survive the second part of it.
All right, we're going to do the Harvard episode.
No, but we
not
can't sort of
today.
say it was because of Gaza. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I think...
But it
Yeah,
was
anyway.
because of Gaza. That's
It
why
started
she was
because
no
of
one, no
Gaza.
one would have even looked at. Anyway,
So 2 points here. Two points. One is that, and this is sort of implicit in what you guys are saying, but for the left here, the most likely scenario is that this is about depressing Joe Biden's share of the vote, right? There is some talk where people are saying, oh, Arab Americans might vote for Donald Trump, which I think there's a version of reality, Earth 17, where that could happen. I don't think Trump cares personally, particularly about the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I think the politics of it will just lead him to be sufficiently pro-Israel that what will end up happening is if there's a problem for Joe Biden, it's a problem with voters being disillusioned and staying home, or in some cases with younger progressive voters voting for Cornel West or Jill Stein.
Or just staying home,
and
too.
that's-
Younger voters don't turn out.
Right.
Part of what I find interesting about this part of the debate is that it to me, it gets to the heart of what foreign policy is for, what it's all about. There are people who see American foreign policy as mainly a means of national security, like protecting the American people from foreign threats, protecting your allies, securing the border, controlling immigration. In this world, for instance, Ukraine doesn't matter, right?
Yep.
Then there are Americans who see foreign policy mainly as a way to project and spread American values, or what they believe should be, bedrock American values, and that's human rights or freedom or prosperity. In this world, supporting Ukraine can be urgent. In this world, you become a single issue voter over what's happening in Gaza. So it's not just like how people feel about this part of the world, or it's also what they think American power is for.
But generally, I think the second group tends to be much smaller than the first group. The kind of people who affirmatively care about using U.S. power to shape events in distant lands are a narrower, they're a more elite, if we will, sort of, or, well-educated, very politically engaged group. Whereas the group that are sort of natural isolationists represents a much larger share of the country. And I think what's happening in the border debate is not that people are, have this sort of very literal-minded view of the federal budget where it's like we're taking $5 from the border and spending $5 in Ukraine. Instead, it's more of a sense of like, if we can't trust our leadership to, take care of our own borders, why would we trust them when they go and make policy about Ukraine, a subject about which, people don't care that much. I think it's more about sort of the trust that is given to elites than like spending in dollars and cents per se.
Although there is a strain of the Republican Party that is actually making that. I mean, Senator J.D. Vance is making that exact argument, which is that they want to spend that money overseas instead of here at home. It's a great political tool.
Right, but I just think the money is not the real issue. I agree that's the rhetoric, but it's not about money. It's about trust in elites.
Money is a very convenient unit of measurement, right? Of like what matters to you, right? Like it's
yes, it is.
So my wife tells me.
It's overwhelmingly the unit of measurement for everything.
But it's like a budget is a moral document, right? Like show me what you spend money on, and I'll show you what you care about. I mean, I do think it is striking though that there have been, and maybe this is just recency bias speaking, but there have been moments in American history where collecting a coalition that believes in an idea of America as a kind of, to quote a phrase, city on the hill, like a beacon of freedom, that I think is an appeal that has been meaningful to Americans in pretty large numbers. It might not be the main motivating reason, but I do think that Americans want to think of America as being a strong, virtuous country. I mean, if not, why would we be having these huge debates about, American history and how we talk about America's slavery and colonialism and all these kinds of things if we didn't care about the, sort of the fundamentally virtuous way in which America is perceived in the world?
There's this peculiar thing where Americans can be up for a kind of isolationism, but it is a kind of city on the hill isolationism. It's like the world is bad and corrupt, and we don't want to mess with it, and we don't want it to mess with us, and we're just going to do our own thing. I think what Americans don't like is a kind of realpolitik, sort of amoral grand strategy. If Americans are going to be in the world, we want to believe that we're fighting for democracy. Otherwise, we're just going to sort of pull back and do our own thing. Whereas a figure like Henry Kissinger, even though American elites all sort of, liked him and feted him till the end, is, I think, deeply out of step with the national character. Americans don't want to hear arguments about, like, the balance of power and things like that.
They don't want to be the world's policeman. I mean, this is what Trump hits on. He's like, we don't need to be doing this. NATO needs to step up. Europe needs to step up. Well, this should not be our responsibility.
And in a sense, this collapsing of the foreign and the domestic that we've talked about on some of these issues is part of the appeal, I think, of Trumpism, and that he's pushing back against it with this sort of nationalist populism. Like, what does he keep on saying? If you don't have a border, you don't have a country anymore. That erosion of what we think of as foreign and domestic, between us and them, between there and here, that's part of what Trumpism is responding to, and that's part of what he says in blunt and sometimes crude ways in his campaign.
Yeah,
but at the same time, and I agree with that, but there is also a kind of globalization of nationalist anxiety.
Yes.
Like,
irony.
Donald Trump succeeds in 2015 and 2016 in part because of things like the Syrian migrant crisis in Europe and some of the Islamic State's terrorist attacks in Europe. Now, obviously, there were some terrorist attacks in the U.S. too, but I think the shadow of Europe's challenge with migration and Europe's challenge with radical Islam totally hung over U.S. politics, and especially conservative politics, at the time when Trump was coming on the scene. And I think that dynamic has sort of obviously continued in various ways, that you have a globalization of culture wars over nationalism that's fascinating to watch.
Right. And I think, like, in some ways, the sort of early indicator was Brexit, right? I mean, I remember seeing those results coming in and just, thinking, my God, this thing that never seemed possible was possible. And I don't know that it's particularly worked out very well, but here we are. Okay. In 15 seconds or less, each of you, does foreign policy as an issue favor Trump or Biden in this election?
I'm going with Trump. People are feeling surly about life and the world in general, and that tends to come back and bite the president on the butt.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the whole foreign policy favors the incumbent. It does not work this time around when people see sort of a chaotic world under Biden and a quote unquote strong leader under Donald Trump.
Ross?
I feel like I should be contrarian, but I agree. Certainly, I think right now, if the election were held right now, the foreign policy landscape and the situation in the world would be one of Trump's biggest assets. I think you could imagine events happening that change that do create a rally around the flag effect for Biden. But right now, what's been bad for the world is good for Trump's campaign.
Well, and Trump has the great benefit of having essentially no track record to look back on here, right? I mean, there was
he was the president.
No, his track record is the selling point.
Yeah, but
I hear that all the time.
That was not necessarily that was not his doing.
You do not have to give Trump credit for anything that happened in his presidency to see that the world under Trump, pre-COVID and even during COVID, it was not a time of major warfare, was more stable and in better shape than the world is right now.
I'm going to cheat on this question and say it depends on what happens between now and November, which actually is a very long time. No, but I mean, it's a very long time and a lot can happen, right? I mean,
an eternity.
It's very soon. The election is very soon.
Look at Ross.
All right, guys, let's leave it there. When we come back, hot and cold. And finally, it's time for Hot Cold. And this week, I'm going to be a dictator and seize the hot cold for myself.
Ooh.
Sorry, guys. So Like a lot of people, during the era of peak TV, I essentially abandoned the movies. And so this year, I've just returned to the cinema with a real vengeance. And it's just been such a delight and such a pleasure. And so when the Oscars were announced, I was astonished to see that for the first time in very many years, I'd actually seen the majority of the Best Picture nominees,
Wow.
7 out of 10. And not only that, but I actually would be kind of fine if any of them won.
Nice.
So I'm just really hot on the movies. The movies are great. And in particular, I feel like there are a lot of really great movies for grownups, sophisticated dramas, after years of just, having superheroes shoved down our throats. I just feel like this has just been an incredible year for the movies. And I would just want to shout out one in particular that actually didn't really get much attention from the Oscars. But if you have not seen All of Us Strangers, which stars Andrew Scott, better known to most people as Hot Priest from Fleabag.
Love him.
If you're in the mood to sit in a darkened theater and just cry your eyes out at a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful story, highly recommend. So I am just absolutely red hot on the movies. Have you guys seen anything you love this year?
I've seen a ton this year. No, I'm married to a kind of erstwhile movie critic, so we see everything. Although my enduring problem is they're so long that I still prefer to watch at home so that I can pause 35 times during the course of the 3.5 hours I'm expected to sit through whatever.
I just want to note that we have a current movie critic among us at the moment.
Ross?
Yeah, no, this was a really good year. I mean, I have been a big movie pessimist. I wrote a big piece for this newspaper about sort of the end of the movies as the sort of shared defining American art form a couple of years ago. And I think there's no question this is the best year for movies since, certainly before the pandemic.
So your piece was wrong.
My piece was wrong. When you write a piece, Carlos, that declares the end of something, if you read the piece carefully, it always includes some important caveats. No, I don't think we're fully back, in part because of people like Michelle who insist on, watching at home and not embracing the full experience.
I'm not going to apologize.
But I think the best side is not so much just the cultural salience of Barbie and Oppenheimer together and these kind of things, but the Marvel and the superhero industry falling on hard times. So the best thing about 2023 in movies was that a lot of superhero movies disappointed, and here's to that.
Plus, I got to buy a pink jumpsuit to wear to Barbie. Just saying.
I've also returned to the movies a little bit, but I'm doing it by returning to sort of old movies that I never saw.
Oh my God.
And I'd never seen The French Connection, and I saw it recently.
Picking your feet in Poughkeepsie.
I loved it. I love The French Connection. The car chase is one of where Gene Hackman is chasing the train is one of the most amazing scenes I've ever seen. But that also, like Michelle, that keeps me in the house. It doesn't leave me out among the humans.
If you lived here in New York City, you could, like me, be a member of Film Forum, where I recently saw for the first time The Third Man. Fantastic movie.
My husband's favorite movie.
So
wow.
They had 500 years of peace and tranquility, and what did they get?
Okay.
The Cuckoo Clock.
All right. Let's wrap it up, guys. Let's wrap it up. Okay,
I
wonderful.
could do Orson Welles all day.
I'm here for that, Ross.
Wonderful talking with you all. All right.
Thanks, Lydia.
See you next week.
Till next week.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks for joining our conversation. If you liked it, be sure to follow Matter of Opinion on your favorite podcast app. And let us know what other key issues we should talk about next by leaving us a voicemail at 212-556-7440. Or you can email us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com. Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Derek Arthur. It is edited by Jordana Hochman. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Efim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samilewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.